famous of Johann Sebastian Bach's children, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, who wrote a treatise on how to play keyboard instruments. Mozart's father, Leopold Mozart, wrote a treatise on how to play the violin. Quantz wrote a manual on how to play the flute. So you start to have a greater access to music. And this is something then that the music of this era reflects, because there was a big style change from the end of the Baroque, which was this grandiose expression and these very dense polyphonic textures and these large-scale works like, Johann Sebastian Bach's St. Matthew Passion, which takes over 3 hours to perform. That work was written for Good Friday service. And it's based on Matthew 26 and 27. So Matthew 26, he's set for the first half of the service, so it's an hour and a half. And then he had the sermon. And then he had the second over an hour and a half, that was Matthew 27. So it's huge, huge work. So style changed, and Bach's works weren't popular when he wrote them during his lifetime. It wasn't until 1829 was a historic concert that Felix Mendelssohn organized at the St. Matthew Passion that reintroduced Bach's music to Europe. And then it became very, very popular, famous. But style was changing in the 1720s into what became the classical style. So it was intended to be something that was simple and easily understood by the listener. So the composer was trying to make something that was accessible. And so that's why you had these simple homophonic textures, and you had this very rational use of form, like sonata allegro. So that's what arose in the beginning of the classical period. And so that's all it kind of reflects this rise of the middle class and of trying to write music for the average listener. Now, the great masters, Haydn and Mozart, were writing works that were more than just simple little things, And so, but they would be criticized for having music that was too complicated, too hard to understand. So that was kind of the sensibility of that era, is that, you should be able to understand things the first time you hear them, You shouldn't have to really think about it that much. So, this idea of an international style developed. So this pre-classical era was something that was happening from the 1720s until like the 1760 or so, something like that. And at that point, then, the great masterpieces of Haydn and Mozart firmly established then this sense of excellence that's known as Viennese Classicism. And that was the basis for Beethoven and for Schubert. So these styles that were emerging in the 1720s were called galant. You'll see different spellings of this. Sometimes you'll see it with an E, and sometimes with just one L. But this had to do with this style of music that was intentionally simple and easy to understand. And so it treated music as something that was entertainment. So rather than being something that provoked deep thought. And so it featured homophonic textures, it was featuring closed phrasing, so regular patterns, and it just intended to delight and please the listener. So we're going to talk about this style more in the chamber music section, and I'll talk about some of the different versions of this, the Rococo in France, the Ensemble in North Germany, and we'll look at this era. But this is what preceded the classical period and what was happening concurrent with the end of the Baroque era. So, some things that I want to have you think about is just some basic characteristics of the Enlightenment and how these are reflected in Viennese Classicism. So one thing has to do with this idea of rational thought. And so this is something that is objective and logical. This then is expressed in Viennese Classicism with this idea of logic in the form, so logic in formal construction. And the Viennese classical era has an emphasis on objectivity. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the idea of emphasis on balance. So you can see this with the classical style of symmetrical phrasing. So very often the phrases were constructed in pairs. You'd have a consequent phrase that would be answered, or excuse me, antecedent phrase that would be answered by a consequent phrase. So I'll put here antecedent, consequent. So it's like a statement and then a response, but you have this balance of symmetrical phrasing. Then this era has this sense of egalitarian concerns in the Enlightenment, which is seen with classical music appealing to the average person to delight and please. And then the final aspect of the Enlightenment is this emphasis on clarity of thought. And so it was a prosaic age, and so more prose than poetry. This is seen in the classical musical style as a clarity of texture and of the sound ideal. So the clarity of quality of sound. So if I ask you a question on the test about classicism in the arts and the relationship of elements of the Enlightenment with Viennese Classicism, you should talk about these kind of points, okay? So that's one of the important things that you should be thinking about is what is characteristic of the classical style and what's characteristic of the Romantic. So I'll refer you again to the chart that's on page 229 in your text. That you're studying that. Definitely that'll be on the first test. But I'll have something about classicism in the arts and then romanticism in the arts. So those two basic stylistic elements are what you want to get a good handle on. Okay? So we'll see you on Thursday.